The massive silver doors of the Galactic Defense Academy slid open with a soft hiss. Quan Tai-ho stepped through first, his dark eyes taking in the enormous hall that stretched before them. Behind him, 3 other humans followed quietly. They all wore the same simple gray uniforms that marked them as new trainees. The hall was filled with beings Tai-ho had only seen in training videos back on Earth. Tall insect-like creatures with 6 arms moved in quick, jerky motions. Floating energy beings that looked like living light drifted near the ceiling. Rock-skinned giants stood in perfect rows, their massive forms casting long shadows across the polished floor. But what struck Tai-ho most was the silence. Despite hundreds of different species filling the space, barely any sound could be heard. No casual conversation, no laughter. Everyone kept their distance from everyone else as if invisible walls separated each group. Park So-jin walked beside Tai-ho, her trained psychologist mind already analyzing what she saw. Back on Earth, she had studied human behavior for years before joining the space program. Here she could see patterns that seemed wrong to her human understanding. Every species stayed with their own kind. When predator species walked by, others would step back or look away. Fear seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. "This place feels like a prison," whispered Lee Han-sol, the youngest of their group. At 22, he had been an engineer on Earth before volunteering for the academy. His bright curiosity, which had served him well in his technical work, now seemed out of place in this tense environment. Choi Yunji said nothing, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. She had been a combat instructor on Earth, training soldiers for dangerous missions. She understood discipline and order. But this felt different. This felt like fear masquerading as discipline. A loud voice boomed across the hall. "New recruits, form lines by species designation." The voice belonged to Instructor Velthar, a 7-foot-tall reptilian being with scales that shifted color from dark green to black. His yellow eyes swept over the crowd as various species quickly arranged themselves into neat rows. The humans watched as each group moved with practiced efficiency, maintaining careful distances from other species. Tai-ho looked at his 3 companions. They stood together naturally, not because they were ordered to, but because it felt right. On Earth, soldiers worked together regardless of their backgrounds. Here it seemed like cooperation was replaced by careful tolerance. Humans, Instructor Velthar's gaze fell on them. His voice carried a note of curiosity mixed with skepticism. "You are the newest additions to our academy. Your species has only recently joined the galactic community." The instructor began walking around them in a slow circle. Other trainees watched with interest. Some seemed curious about these new beings. Others appeared dismissive, as if humans were just another weak species seeking protection from stronger ones. "This academy has one purpose," Velthar continued, his voice echoing in the vast hall. "We train defenders against the greatest threat our galaxy has known, the Void Stalkers." A ripple of tension passed through the assembled trainees at the mention of that name. Even the most confident-looking species seemed to shrink slightly. Tai-ho noticed how the energy beings flickered more rapidly, and the insect creatures' antennae twitched nervously. "For 300 years, these entities have attacked our colonies, our trade routes, our homeworlds. They are predators beyond normal understanding. They feed on fear, grow stronger from panic, and strike fastest when their prey shows weakness." So Jin felt a chill run down her spine, but not from fear of these void stalkers. What disturbed her was how the instructor spoke about fear, as if it were the natural state of existence. On Earth, humans certainly experienced fear, but they also learned to work through it, to use it as information rather than letting it control their actions. "Every species that has graduated from this academy shares certain traits," the instructor continued. "Fast reflexes, immediate threat response, complete compliance with survival protocols. These are not suggestions. These are the requirements for staying alive." Han-sol raised his hand slightly. The gesture drew surprised looks from other trainees. Apparently, interrupting instructors was not common here. "Yes, human Han-sol," Velthar said, consulting a datapad. "Sir, what if the survival protocols don't work for a particular situation?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several alien trainees made sounds that might have been gasps or warnings. The instructor's scale shifted to a darker shade of green. "The protocols work because they are based on 3 centuries of combat experience against the Void Stalkers. They work because they keep you alive. They work because questioning them gets you killed. the instructor's yellow eyes fixed on each human in turn. Your species has never faced a void stalker. You have no experience with true galactic threats. You will learn to follow protocols exactly, or you will not survive your first real encounter. Yunji stepped forward slightly. Her movement was subtle but clear to anyone trained in military bearing. She was not backing down, but she was also not challenging authority. It was a response that spoke of confidence without aggression. "We understand, sir. We're here to learn." Velthar studied her for a long moment. In his years of training recruits, he had seen every possible reaction to his intimidation tactics. Fear, anger, submission, rebellion. But this human showed something different. Respectful attention without the underlying terror that motivated most species. It was unusual. "Very well," he said finally. "You will be assigned to Dormitory Section 7 with mixed species housing. Your first training session begins at dawn cycle. Do not be late." As the assembly broke up, the humans found themselves walking together toward their assigned quarters. Around them, other species moved in quick, efficient patterns, still maintaining those careful distances from each other. "Did you notice," Sojin said quietly, "how they all seem afraid of each other as much as they fear these void stalkers?" Taeho nodded. "It's like they've built their entire society around avoiding threats instead of facing them." "Maybe that's how you survive out here," Hansol suggested. "Maybe we just don't understand because we're new." But Yunji shook her head. "I've trained soldiers for years. Fear can keep you alive, but it can also get you killed. These beings are so focused on not dying that they might have forgotten how to truly live." As they walked through corridors filled with alien architecture and strange symbols, the humans began to understand that their real training would not just be about learning to fight void stalkers. It would be about learning to exist in a galaxy where fear had become the foundation of survival itself. Behind them, Instructor Velthar watched their retreating forms with growing curiosity. In his private notes that evening, he would write, "Human responses do not match established patterns. Further observation required." He did not yet realize that this simple observation would eventually change everything the Academy thought it knew about courage, survival, and the true nature of strength. The training grounds of the Galactic Defense Academy stretched out like a small city. Different sections were designed for different species and their unique abilities. Quan Tai-ho stood with his fellow humans at the edge of the main testing area, watching other trainees demonstrate their natural talents. It was their third day at the Academy, and the assessment week had begun. Each species would show what they could do best, and instructors would measure their combat potential against the Void Stalker threat. The first group to demonstrate were the insectoid beings called the Zephyrians. Cadet Zixmora stepped into the center ring, her 6 arms moving in patterns too fast for human eyes to follow. When the test began, holographic threats appeared around her from all directions. Projectiles, energy beams, and simulated predator attacks came at her simultaneously. Zixmora became a blur of motion. Her body twisted and bent in ways that seemed impossible, dodging every attack with incredible speed. Her reflexes were so fast that she seemed to know where threats would appear before they actually showed up. The demonstration lasted only 30 seconds, but in that time she avoided over 200 different attacks. The instructors made approving sounds. Velthar nodded and marked something on his datapad. "Excellent reflexive response. Zephyrian combat readiness confirmed at level 7. Park So-jin watched carefully, noting how Zixmora moved. The insectoid was incredibly fast, but her movements followed predictable patterns. Each dodge was perfectly executed, but also perfectly programmed by millions of years of evolution. There was no creativity, no adaptation beyond what her species had always done. Next came the crystalline collective, beings made of living crystal who could change their physical form. Their representative, a cadet whose name sounded like breaking glass, demonstrated by phase shifting through solid matter. When attacks came, the crystal being would become partially transparent, allowing projectiles to pass harmlessly through its body. The display was impressive, but again So-jin noticed limitations. The phase shifting worked perfectly against direct attacks, but when the test included environmental hazards like gas clouds or area effect weapons, the crystal being struggled to respond effectively. Lee Han-sol leaned toward Taeho and whispered, "They're all really good at one thing, but not much else." Taeho nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. Each species had evolved perfect responses to specific types of threats, but those same specializations seemed to create blind spots. The energy beings were next. Cadet Nethgor floated into the testing area, its form looking like a small star wrapped in controlled lightning. When the test began, Nethgor dispersed into dozens of smaller energy fragments, spreading across the entire testing area. Attacks that would destroy a solid target passed harmlessly through the dispersed energy pattern. But when the test included electromagnetic interference, Nethgor's fragments became confused and struggled to reform properly. The energy being passed the test, but barely, and Instructor Velthar's expression showed concern rather than approval. Several more species demonstrated their abilities. Rock-skinned giants who could absorb tremendous damage, flying beings who could escape any ground-based threat, aquatic species who could survive in environments that would kill others instantly. Each demonstration followed the same pattern. Incredible strength in one area, but noticeable weakness in others. More importantly, each species seemed locked into their evolutionary responses. They could not imagine dealing with threats in any way other than how their ancestors had always done it. Finally, it was the humans' turn. Humans. Step forward for assessment, Instructor Velthar announced. The 4 humans walked into the center ring together. This was unusual. Other species had been tested individually, with each member demonstrating the same basic abilities. But humans seemed to naturally move as a group. Begin individual assessment, Velthar commanded. Tejo looked at his companions, then back at the instructor. Sir, permission to demonstrate as a team. Several alien trainees made surprised noises. Velthar's scales shifted color slightly, a sign of confusion among his species. Individual assessment is standard protocol, the instructor replied. Yes, sir, but humans work better as teams. Our abilities complement each other. This was not how things were done at the academy. Each species demonstrated their natural advantages, received their ratings, and moved on to specialized training based on those ratings. The idea of mixing different approaches within a single species was unknown. Velthar considered for a moment. In 3 decades of training, he had never had recruits request a group assessment, but he was curious to see what these newcomers thought they could accomplish. Very well. Proceed with group assessment. The test began with the same multi-directional attacks that had challenged all the previous species. But instead of each human responding individually, they immediately spread out and began communicating. 3 high, 2 low, Choi Yunji called out, her combat experience allowing her to quickly categorize the threats. Got the pattern, Hansol responded, his engineering mind already calculating trajectory and timing. So Jin positioned herself where she could observe the overall situation, calling out changes and coordinating the group's response. Tejo moved to wherever support was needed most. What happened next surprised everyone watching. The humans did not try to dodge every attack like the Zephyrians. They did not phase shift like the crystallines. They did not disperse like the energy beings. Instead, they did something no one expected. They prioritized. Some attacks they avoided. Others they absorbed with protective equipment. Some they redirected into harmless directions. A few they simply ignored, determining that those particular threats were not actually dangerous. When environmental hazards were added to the test, the humans adapted their strategy. When electromagnetic interference was introduced, they switched to hand signals and continued coordinating effectively. The test that had challenged individual specialists became manageable through human teamwork and flexibility. But their performance numbers were not impressive by Academy standards. They were not as fast as Zixmora, not as durable as the rock giants, not as adaptable as the phase shifters in their specific areas of expertise. Instructor Velthar studied his readings with a frown. By every traditional measure, the humans were average at best. Their reaction times were adequate but not exceptional. Their physical capabilities were unremarkable compared to species that had evolved for combat. Their technological adaptations were basic. Assessment complete, he announced. Human capabilities noted as tactically limited but potentially useful for support roles. The other trainees began to disperse, returning to their species groups. But something had changed in the dynamics. A few of the alien cadets lingered, watching the humans with new interest. Zixmora approached the humans as they left the testing area. Her movements were still quick and jerky, but she seemed to be making an effort to slow down for conversation. Your coordination was interesting, she said in her clicking voice. Zephyrians do not usually work with others during combat, Sojin smiled. Would you like to learn how we do it? The question clearly surprised Zixmora. Cross-species training was not part of the academy curriculum. Each species learned to maximize their own abilities, not to adopt techniques from others. But Zixmora found herself nodding. Yes, that would be educational. As they walked toward the dormitories, more alien cadets began joining the conversation. What had started as a simple assessment was becoming something unprecedented in the academy's history. Instructor Velthar watched from a distance, updating his notes. Human assessment results inconclusive, individual capabilities limited, but group dynamics show unusual adaptability. Recommend extended observation period. He did not yet understand that he was witnessing the beginning of a fundamental change in how the academy thought about strength, survival, and the true meaning of military effectiveness. The training week had passed quickly, and now the moment every cadet feared had arrived. Combat Assessment Gamma 7 was the academy's most important test. It was the simulation that would determine who was ready to face real Void Stalkers and who needed more training. The main holographic chamber was massive, larger than 3 Earth football fields combined. Its walls could project any environment, any threat, any scenario the instructors could imagine. But today it would show only one thing, the thing that haunted the dreams of every species in the galaxy, a Void Stalker. Quan Taiho stood with his mixed species team at one of the simulation entry points. Over the past week, something unprecedented had happened at the academy. The rigid species-based groups had begun to break down. Alien cadets were asking humans about teamwork techniques. Humans were learning about different species' natural abilities. His team now included Zixmora the Zephyrian, whose incredible speed had impressed everyone during assessments. There was also Nethgor the energy being, who could disperse and reform at will. A rock-skinned giant named Korthak provided their heavy defense capabilities, and of course his fellow humans, Park Sojin, Lee Han-sol, and Choi Yunji. Instructor Velthar's voice echoed through the chamber, reaching all 12 teams positioned around the simulation space. His reptilian features were more serious than usual, and his scales had shifted to their darkest green coloration. Cadets, today you face the enemy that has terrorized our galaxy for 3 centuries. This simulation is based on actual Void Stalker encounters. The entity you will face behaves exactly as the real creatures do. The instructor paused, letting his words sink in. Every cadet in the chamber knew someone who had been killed by Void Stalkers. Entire colonies had been wiped out. Military fleets had disappeared without a trace. The scenario is colony defense. Civilian evacuation is in progress. Your job is to buy time for the transports to escape. The Void Stalker will appear when evacuation reaches 50% completion. Sojin felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her psychological training kept her calm. She had studied fear responses in humans for years. She knew that panic was the enemy of clear thinking, and clear thinking was what would keep them alive. When the Void Stalker signature appears, all personnel must immediately take evasive action. This is not a suggestion. This is the protocol that has kept our species alive. React instantly, move fast. Do not hesitate. The instructor's yellow eyes swept across the assembled cadets. The simulation measures 3 things: reaction time to threat appearance, evasion efficiency under pressure, and survival probability. Every class that has graduated from this academy has followed this protocol successfully. Han-sol noticed how tense the other cadets had become. Even the usually confident species like the rock giants seemed nervous. The mere mention of Void Stalkers had changed the entire atmosphere in the chamber. Teams, take your positions. Simulation begins in 60 seconds. The holographic environment materialized around them. They were standing in the main plaza of a small colony world. Buildings rose around them, their architecture mixing styles from dozens of different species. In the distance, transport ships were loading civilians and lifting off into the artificial sky. The simulation felt completely real. Tejo could smell the recycled air of the colony. He could hear the sounds of frightened families hurrying toward evacuation points. Children were crying. Adults were carrying whatever belongings they could manage. Evacuation at 20%, announced the computer voice. The team spread out across the plaza, taking defensive positions. Each team followed the tactical patterns their species had developed over generations of fighting. The fast species took positions where they could retreat quickly. The tough species positioned themselves where they could absorb attacks. The energy beings spread out to minimize target concentration. Evacuation at 30%. Yunji checked her equipment one final time. As a former combat instructor, she understood the importance of preparation. But she also understood something else that seemed lost on many of the other cadets. She understood that sometimes the best combat technique was not to fight at all. Evacuation at 40%. The tension in the plaza was becoming unbearable. Several of the alien cadets were already shifting nervously, ready to move at the first sign of danger. Their instincts were screaming at them to be ready to run. Evacuation at 50%. The change was immediate and terrifying. The artificial sky began to darken, but not like a natural sunset. The darkness seemed to pour in from nowhere, swallowing light and sound as it spread. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. Even the holographic civilians seemed to sense something wrong, their movements becoming more frantic. Then it appeared. The Void Stalker emerged from the darkness like a living nightmare. It was impossible to describe its exact shape because it seemed to change constantly, flowing between different forms of pure terror. Sometimes it looked like a massive predator with too many teeth. Sometimes it resembled a dark cloud that moved with predatory intelligence. Sometimes it was just an absence, a hole in reality that hurt to look at directly. But whatever form it took, two things remained constant. It was huge, easily the size of a building, and it radiated hunger, malice, and unstoppable deadly intent. Void Stalker signature confirmed. The computer announced in emergency tones. All personnel take evasive action immediately. Instructor Velthar's voice boomed across the chamber. All trainees evasive maneuvers now. The reaction was instant and exactly as expected. Every non-human cadet immediately scattered according to their species' optimal survival patterns. Zixmora used her incredible speed to zigzag across the plaza in movements too fast to track. The energy beings like Nethgor dispersed into component particles, spreading across the area. The rock giants activated their defensive shields and retreated to hardened positions. The flying species took to the air in complex evasion patterns. The entire plaza became a chaos of movement as dozens of cadets implemented 3 centuries of refined survival tactics. But in the center of all this frantic activity, 4 figures stood perfectly still. The humans had not moved. Taeho, Sojin, Hansol, and Yunji remained exactly where they had been when the Void Stalker appeared. They were not frozen in terror. They were not paralyzed by fear. They were standing calmly, watching the approaching nightmare with steady, focused attention. The Void Stalker, which had been advancing toward the plaza with the confidence of a predator that had never been successfully resisted, suddenly slowed its approach. For the first time in 3 centuries of simulations, something unexpected was happening. The unstoppable force had encountered something it did not understand. 4 small beings who refused to run, refused to hide, but also showed no signs of aggressive challenge. The entity that fed on fear and panic found itself facing something it had no programming to handle. Calm, steady human attention. In the control room, Instructor Velthar stared at his instruments in complete shock. Every sensor was confirming what his eyes showed him, but his mind refused to accept it. The Void Stalker had stopped advancing. Instructor Velthar's clawed fingers froze over the simulation controls. In 30 years of training cadets, he had never seen anything like this. The Void Stalker simulation, which had never hesitated in thousands of test runs, had actually stopped moving toward its targets. The massive entity hung in the artificial sky above the colony plaza, its dark form shifting and writhing. But instead of the relentless advance that defined every previous encounter, it seemed confused, uncertain. Its attention was fixed on the 4 humans who stood motionless in the center of the chaos. Around them, alien cadets continued their evasive maneuvers, following protocols that had been drilled into them since childhood. But their movements were becoming less coordinated. Several had stopped their escape patterns to stare at the humans in shock. Quan Taeho took a single step forward. The Void Stalker actually moved backward. The control room erupted in surprised voices as instructors from different species tried to make sense of what they were seeing. This violated every known behavior pattern. Void Stalkers never retreated. They never showed uncertainty. They certainly never responded to the actions of beings they considered prey. Park So-jin began to speak, but not to her fellow humans. Her voice was calm and steady, directed toward the massive threat hovering above them. "We see you," she said clearly. "We know what you are. We are not afraid of you, but we are not trying to fight you either." The psychological training that had made her one of Earth's best behavioral specialists was guiding her actions now. She understood predator psychology better than anyone else on her planet. Most predators preferred easy targets. They wanted prey that would run, panic, and make mistakes. They avoided confrontations that might result in injury or excessive energy expenditure. The Void Stalker's form shifted more rapidly, cycling through different shapes as if searching for one that would trigger the expected fear response. It became a giant spider with burning eyes, then a massive snake with poisonous fangs, then something that looked like a living tornado filled with teeth. But the humans remained calm, watching with steady attention. Lee Han-sol, whose engineering mind was always analyzing problems, began to understand what was happening. "It is a program," he said quietly, though his voice carried in the strange silence of the plaza. "It expects certain responses. When it does not get them, it does not know what to do next." The young engineer was right, though he did not fully realize it yet. The Void Stalker simulations were based on recordings of actual encounters. Every real Void Stalker had faced the same responses from their victims: fear, panic, desperate flight, or hopeless aggression. The creatures had evolved to handle these reactions with devastating efficiency. Choi Yoonji and Han Sol began to move, but not in the rapid, evasive patterns the other species were using. They spread out slowly, deliberately, their movements controlled and purposeful. To the watching alien cadets, it looked like they were setting up a flanking maneuver, but their body language was completely wrong for an attack. There was no aggression in their posture, no preparation for violence. Instead, they moved with the careful attention of people who were studying something dangerous but interesting. The Void Stalker responded to this new development by retreating further. Its massive form began to contract, becoming smaller and more compact. The darkness around it lightened slightly, as if the entity was pulling back some of the fear-inducing energy it projected. Zix Mora, who had been zigzagging at top speed around the plaza, suddenly stopped her evasive pattern. Her compound eyes, designed to track multiple threats simultaneously, were focused entirely on the humans and their impossible interaction with the Void Stalker. "How are they doing this?" she clicked in her rapid Zephyrian language. Nethgor, the energy being, had partially reformed from his dispersed state. His electrical patterns were fluctuating in what other energy beings would recognize as extreme confusion. The humans are not following any known survival protocol. Korthak, the massive rock-skinned giant, lowered his defensive shield slightly. His species had survived for millions of years by being tougher than their enemies, but he had never seen anyone survive by simply standing still and watching. The Void Stalker made one last attempt to trigger a fear response. It suddenly expanded to twice its previous size, its form becoming more solid and defined. It resembled a perfect nightmare, combining elements of every predator that had ever haunted the dreams of intelligent life. So-jin smiled, not a nervous smile, or a frightened smile, or even a brave smile. She smiled with genuine professional interest, the way a scientist might smile when observing a particularly interesting specimen. "You are very good at being scary," she said to the entity. "But we are not your usual prey, are we?" The Void Stalker's response was immediate and unprecedented. It retreated rapidly, pulling back toward the edge of the simulation area. The artificial darkness began to lift. The temperature started to return to normal, and then, for the first time in the recorded history of Void Stalker encounters, the entity disengaged completely. It simply left. The simulation space returned to normal daylight. The holographic colonists continued their evacuation, unaware that the threat that should have destroyed them had chosen to retreat instead. Every cadet in the plaza stood frozen, staring at the four humans who had somehow forced the most feared predator in the galaxy to withdraw through nothing more than calm attention and steady nerves. In the control room, Instructor Velthar was frantically checking his instruments. Every sensor confirmed what had happened. The Void Stalker simulation, using behavioral patterns recorded from hundreds of real encounters, had been forced to retreat by four beings who simply refused to play by the established rules. "Sir?" one of the technicians said nervously. Should we restart the simulation? There might be a malfunction. Velthar studied the data streaming across his screens. Threat recognition systems had functioned perfectly. Fear response measurements had worked normally for all non-human participants. Environmental controls had operated within acceptable parameters. There was no malfunction. The humans had actually done what the sensors said they had done. No, he said slowly. End the simulation. All teams report to debriefing chamber immediately. As the holographic environment faded away, the cadets began moving toward the exit. But the careful species separation that had defined the academy for centuries was breaking down. Alien cadets were surrounding the humans, asking rapid questions in a dozen different languages. How did you know it would retreat? What made you think standing still would work? Can you teach us to do that? Tejo looked around at the excited faces of beings from across the galaxy. A week ago, these same cadets had barely acknowledged human existence. Now they were treating the humans like they had discovered some incredible secret. We did not know it would work, he admitted honestly. We just knew that running away did not feel right. Yunji added, On Earth we learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to stand up to them without fighting. Not every threat has to be met with fear or violence. As they walked toward the debriefing, Sojin noticed Instructor Velthar watching them from the control room window. His reptilian features were unreadable, but she could sense that something fundamental had changed in how he viewed the human cadets. Behind them, the empty simulation chamber powered down, its systems already beginning to analyze and record what had happened. In the Academy's databanks, a new file was being created. For the first time in 3 centuries, someone had found a way to make a Void Stalker retreat. The debriefing chamber had never been so crowded or so loud. Cadets from every species were talking at once, their voices mixing into a chaos of different languages and communication methods. The careful order that usually defined Academy meetings had completely broken down. At the center of the attention sat the 4 human trainees, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden interest. Just hours ago, they had been considered the weakest members of their class. Now everyone wanted to understand how they had achieved the impossible. Instructor Velthar stood at the front of the chamber, his scales shifting through different shades as he struggled to process what had happened. Behind him, a large display screen showed the recorded data from the simulation. Every sensor reading, every biometric measurement, every tactical analysis pointed to the same incredible conclusion. The humans had forced a Void Stalker to retreat. Order, Velthar called out, his voice cutting through the noise. We will conduct this debriefing according to standard protocols. But even as he said it, he knew that nothing about this situation was standard. In 3 decades of training, he had never seen cadets react this way to a simulation result. Usually, successful completion of combat assessment Gamma 7 was met with relief and quiet satisfaction. This was completely different. Human trainees, explain your actions during the simulation, he commanded. Park Sojin stood up slowly. Her psychological training had taught her how to address groups, but she had never faced an audience like this. Beings from 17 different species were staring at her with expressions she could barely recognize, let alone interpret. We did not follow evasive protocols because we believed they would not work, she said clearly. The statement sent a ripple of shocked sounds through the audience. Questioning established protocols was not done at the Academy. The survival techniques had been developed through centuries of combat experience and the deaths of countless defenders. The protocols have saved millions of lives, Instructor Velthar said, his voice carrying a warning tone. Yes, sir, Sojin acknowledged, and they work very well for the species that developed them. But humans did not evolve the same way as other species here. She gestured to Zixmora, who was sitting in the front row with her compound eyes fixed on the human speaker. Zephyrians evolved to escape predators through speed and agility. Your evasive patterns are perfect for creatures that survived by being faster than their enemies. Then she indicated Korthak, whose massive rock-skinned form took up 3 regular seats. The stone giants survived by being tougher than their threats. Your defensive protocols make sense for beings who can absorb tremendous damage. Nethgor flickered slightly as Sojin's attention turned to him. Energy beings survived by dispersing and avoiding concentrated attacks. Your protocols work because you can literally become untouchable. The alien cadets began to understand where this explanation was leading, but they were not sure they liked it. But humans, Sojin continued, evolved differently. We were not the fastest, strongest, or toughest species on our planet. We survived through persistence, intelligence, and most importantly, by working together to outlast threats that seemed impossible to defeat. Lee Hansol stood up beside her. On Earth, our ancestors faced predators much larger and stronger than they were. Saber-toothed cats, cave bears, massive wolves. They could not outrun these creatures. They could not overpower them. But they learned something else. His engineering mind helped him explain complex ideas in simple terms. Many predators, even intelligent ones, prefer easy prey. They do not want to waste energy on targets that might fight back effectively. They especially avoid confrontations where they might be injured, even if they could win. Choi Yun-ji joined the explanation. In human military training, we learn that sometimes the best defense is not to retreat or attack, but to make the enemy reconsider whether the fight is worth the cost. The concept was revolutionary to most of the alien cadets. Their species had developed survival strategies based on their natural advantages. They had never considered survival through psychological tactics. Kwon Tai-ho provided the final piece of the explanation. When we stood still during the simulation, we were not frozen by fear. We were presenting ourselves as something the Void Stalker had not encountered before. Not prey running in panic, not a threat attacking in rage. Something else entirely. But how did you know it would work? Asked Zixmora, her rapid clicking voice filled with curiosity. We did not know, Taeho admitted. But we knew that running would confirm we were prey, and we knew that attacking would confirm we were a threat to be eliminated. So we chose a third option. Sojin added the psychological analysis. Predators expect certain responses from their prey. Fear, panic, desperate escape attempts. When those expected responses do not occur, many predators become confused and cautious. She looked directly at Instructor Velthar as she continued. The Void Stalker simulation was programmed based on recorded encounters with real creatures. But every one of those encounters involved species following their traditional survival patterns. The program had no response template for what we did. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If humans were correct, it meant that the galaxy's most feared predator might be vulnerable to tactics that no one had ever tried. But it also meant that everything the Academy had taught about survival might be incomplete. Instructor. Velthar studied his data readings one more time. The human explanation matched the sensor data perfectly. Their biometric readings during the encounter showed elevated alertness but not panic. Their positioning had been strategic but not aggressive. Their behavior had been calculated but not robotic. This approach would not work for other species, he said finally. Maybe not exactly the same way, Sojin agreed, but the principle might work for everyone. Instead of only relying on what your species does naturally, you could learn to do unexpected things that predators are not prepared for. A Zephyrian cadet in the back of the chamber raised one of her 6 arms. Could you teach us these human techniques? The question opened a floodgate. Suddenly, dozens of alien cadets were asking similar questions. Could they learn human tactical thinking? Could they train with mixed species teams? Could they develop new approaches that combined different survival strategies? For the first time in the Academy's history, cadets were asking to learn from a species that had scored poorly on traditional assessments. Instructor Velthar looked around the chaotic chamber and realized that something fundamental had changed. The rigid hierarchies based on natural abilities were beginning to break down. The idea that survival could only come from perfecting existing techniques was being challenged. But most importantly, the assumption that fear was the foundation of tactical thinking was being questioned by beings who had survived through courage instead. Classes will be suspended tomorrow, he announced. All senior instructors will review today's events and determine how to proceed. As the cadets began to file out of the chamber, they were no longer separating by species. Humans walked with Zephyrians. Energy beings drifted alongside stone giants. For the first time, the Academy felt like a place where different beings were learning from each other instead of just tolerating each other's presence. Velthar remained behind, staring at the data screens that showed impossible results. In his private log that night, he would write, "Human approach requires complete revision of tactical doctrine. Traditional protocols may be insufficient against adaptive threats. Recommend immediate implementation of cross-species training programs." But what he did not write What he was not yet ready to admit even to himself was that the humans had taught him something that would change everything. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against fear is not fearlessness, but the wisdom to choose when fear serves you and when it does not. 6 months after the simulation that changed everything, the Galactic Defense Academy looked completely different. The rigid dormitory sections that had separated species for centuries had been replaced with integrated living areas. The training schedules that had isolated different beings from each other had been restructured around mixed species teams. Most importantly, the survival protocols that had remained unchanged for 300 years had been completely rewritten. Quan Tai Ho stood in the main training facility, watching a group of first-year cadets practice what the Academy now called adaptive response training. The scene would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. Zephyrian cadet was working with 2 humans and an energy being, learning to incorporate deliberate pauses into her natural speed patterns. Instead of constantly zigzagging at maximum velocity, she was practicing controlled stops that would confuse predator targeting systems. Good. Yixera, called out Instructor Sojin, who had been promoted from trainee to teaching assistant in record time. Remember, the goal is not to be unpredictable for its own sake. The goal is to make threats. Reconsider their attack calculations, Park. Sojin had become the Academy's first expert in presence combat, the new discipline that taught psychological tactics alongside physical ones. Her classes were the most popular in the Academy's history, with waiting lists that stretched for months. At another training station, Lee Hansel was working with a group of stone giants, teaching them how to use their massive size for intimidation rather than just defense. The rock-skinned beings were learning to position themselves in ways that suggested overwhelming force without actually committing to combat. The key, Hansel explained to his students, is to make the threat think that attacking you will cost more than it is worth. You do not have to actually fight. You just have to make fighting look like a bad idea. The young engineer had discovered that his talent for analyzing systems extended to analyzing the psychology of combat. His technical approach to understanding predator behavior had revolutionized how the Academy thought about threat assessment. Choi Yun-ji had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation. The former combat instructor had become the Academy's leading expert in mixed-species tactical coordination. Her classes taught teams of different beings how to combine their natural abilities in ways that no single species could achieve alone. Today she was working with an advanced class that included representatives from 12 different species. They were practicing a complex maneuver that required perfect timing and communication between beings with completely different physical capabilities and sensory systems. Execute pattern Taeho 7, she commanded. The team moved with precision that would have been impossible under the old Academy system. Fast species provided reconnaissance and distraction. Tough species created mobile defensive positions. Energy beings established communication networks and electronic warfare capabilities, all coordinated by human tactical thinking that saw opportunities where others saw only problems. The maneuver was named after Quan Tai Ho, who had become something of a legend among the cadets. The human who had first stepped toward a Void Stalker instead of away from it was now the Academy's most requested team leader for advanced training exercises, but Taeho himself was focused on an even more important development. In the center of the training facility, a mixed-species team was preparing for the Academy's new ultimate test, real Void Stalker engagement. 3 days earlier, a Void Stalker had been detected approaching an outer colony. Instead of evacuating immediately, the colony had requested Academy intervention. They wanted to test the new techniques under actual combat conditions. It was the moment everyone had been training for, but it was also terrifying. If the human theories were wrong, if the psychological tactics failed against a real predator instead of a simulation, people would die. Instructor Velthar approached Taeho, his scales showing the deep green coloration that indicated serious concern. "The strike team departs in 2 hours," he said. "Are you certain about this course of action?" Taeho looked at the team preparing their equipment nearby. Zixamora was there, her movements now showing the controlled precision of someone who had learned to think before reacting. Nethgor flickered with the steady patterns of an energy being who had gained confidence through understanding. Korthak stood with the patient strength of someone who knew when to fight and when to simply be immovable. But most importantly, there were beings from 7 different species working together as a single unit. The old academy would never have allowed such a mixed team for something this dangerous. The new academy would not consider any other approach. I am as certain as anyone can be when facing the unknown, Taeho replied honestly. But we have learned something these past months. We learned that our greatest strength is not any single technique or ability. Our greatest strength is that we can adapt and support each other. Velthar nodded slowly. The instructor, who had once believed that fear was the foundation of tactical thinking, had become one of the strongest supporters of the new methods. His own species, the Saurian Dominants, had begun implementing human-inspired training programs across their military forces. The colony defense fleet reports the Voidstalker will arrive in approximately 6 hours, he said. Long-range sensors confirm it matches the behavioral patterns of a mature hunting entity. This would be different from the simulation. A real Voidstalker would be more intelligent, more adaptable, and infinitely more dangerous than any program. If the human theories were wrong, the strike team would not get a second chance. Sojin approached them, carrying the psychological profile data she had been analyzing all morning. The approaching entity shows hunting patterns consistent with a creature that has successfully destroyed at least 12 colonies, she reported. It will expect standard evasion and panic responses, which means it will be unprepared for what we actually do, added Yunji, who was running final equipment checks on the team's gear. The past 6 months had transformed all 4 humans from struggling trainees into the Academy's most effective instructors. But more than that, they had helped transform the entire philosophy of galactic defense. Han Sol joined the group, his engineering analysis complete. Colony infrastructure shows good defensive positions for psychological positioning, he said. We can establish presence points that will maximize our apparent threat level without requiring actual combat. The young engineer had become an expert in what the Academy now called deterrent architecture. He could look at any battlefield and see ways to use positioning, lighting, and environmental factors to make defenders appear more formidable than they actually were. Team leaders, final briefing in 1 hour, Velthar announced to the assembled strike team. As the instructor walked away, the 4 humans stood together for a moment, remembering their first days at the academy when they had been dismissed as weak and inexperienced. Are you nervous? Han Sol asked. Of course, Sojin replied, but being nervous and being afraid are different things. Nervousness can help you stay alert. Fear can get you killed. Besides, Taeho added with a slight smile, we have something no Voidstalker has ever faced before. What is that? Asked Yunji. A galaxy that has learned to think differently. 2 hours later, the strike team boarded their transport vessel. The ship was itself a symbol of how much had changed. Instead of the single-species crews that had been standard before, this ship carried beings from 15 different worlds, all trained in the new integrated combat methods. The journey to the threatened colony took 3 hours. During that time, the team continued to prepare, but their preparation looked nothing like traditional pre-combat rituals. Instead of weapons checks and fear management, they spent their time discussing psychology, communication, and coordination. When they arrived at the colony, they found a population that was scared but not panicking. Word of the Academy's new methods had spread throughout the galaxy. Instead of evacuating immediately, the colonists had chosen to stay and see if the impossible could happen twice. The Voidstalker appeared exactly on schedule. It emerged from hyperspace like a tear in reality itself, a massive entity that seemed to absorb light and sound from the space around it. Long-range sensors confirmed what everyone already knew. This was a mature, experienced predator that had destroyed countless worlds. But as it approached the colony, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual chaos of evacuation ships and panicking defenders, the Voidstalker encountered something it had never seen before. The colony's defensive positions were occupied, but not in the desperate, fearful way it was accustomed to. The defenders stood calmly at their posts. Their formation suggested strength without aggression. Their positioning indicated preparation without panic. Most confusing of all, they made no attempt to hide or run. The Voidstalker slowed its approach. At the center of the colony's main plaza, Quan Tai Ho and his mixed-species team took their positions. They had studied the recordings of their simulation encounter hundreds of times, analyzing every moment, every decision, every response. But this was not a simulation. This was a creature that had killed millions of beings across hundreds of worlds.